Okay, everyone, welcome to the first of what is probably going to be 2 or 3 video lectures for Chapter 8 on metabolism. Chapter 8, I think, is probably one of the most important chapters that we go over in this course because it basically gives you a strong foundation in understanding how cells process energy. And living things like cells do that. That's one of the key features of a living thing, is that it's capable of processing energy, which means it takes energy in from food, for example, converts it to various other forms, and then eventually gives that energy back off to the environment as heat. But the point is that as it's converting the energy from food to various other forms, it can use some of that energy to perform work, cellular work. And there are all sorts of different categories of cellular work that we'll talk about. But the key point here is understanding how it is that cells process energy. This term that you see here on this first slide, metabolism, basically refers to all of the chemical reactions going on in a cell, or really in an entire organism, at any given moment. And that's a lot of chemical reactions. It's estimated that on average, a typical cell has maybe 20,000 chemical reactions occurring at any given second. So 20,000 chemical reactions per second per cell, and there are literally hundreds of trillions of cells that make up your body. So that's a lot of chemistry going on. But all that chemistry considered together is metabolism. And metabolism is largely concerned with two processes: taking big energy-rich molecules that we find in food, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, that sort of thing, breaking them down, extracting their energy, and then using that energy to do work, whether that's powering muscle movement, or setting up nerve impulses, or whether it's building amino acids and proteins or whatever. Those are really the two fundamental things that are going on in terms of metabolism. Tearing food molecules down to extract their energy, and then using that energy to do work, which in many cases includes building other molecules. So think of the living cell as like a miniature chemical factory where thousands of reactions are going on every given second. It extracts energy that's stored in sugars, for example, and other fuels like proteins, fats, and applies that to do work. So cells and living things convert energy. And there are good examples of this energy conversion that I can show you right here. These are two examples of what's called bioluminescence. Okay, bioluminescence. Many organisms actually produce light as a result of their ability to extract energy from food. Take a look at these mushrooms, for example, right? They're glowing in the dark. Well, they're producing light. So these are decomposer organisms. That's what fungi is. And these guys are breaking down what looks like, dead wood tissue in this branch or trunk that they're growing on. They're absorbing carbohydrates, proteins, things like that from that wood tissue, that dead wood tissue, breaking it down and giving off some of the energy of those molecules as light. Okay, that's bioluminescence. Here we have another example: microscopic organisms in the oceans in various parts of the world called dinoflagellates produce this bluish glow called phosphorescence that you can see when conditions are right, with waves breaking on the shore, the beach, or a lot of times cruise ships can see this in their wake. You look behind the cruise ship at night, you see there's a long blue tail of phosphorescence occurring. That is those single-celled dinoflagellates also producing light as a result of their metabolism. Okay, so we need to talk about, first of all, before we get into the meat of this, two basic categories of chemical reactions. The first category is catabolic. So catabolic reactions, RxNS is just an abbreviation for reactions. Catabolic reactions, or also pathways, I should say, as they're called, are chemical reactions that are made up of a lot of smaller chemical reactions, multi-step chemical reactions, in other words, and they release energy by breaking down complex molecules into simpler compounds. Okay, so a pathway is a chemical reaction where we start off, let's say, with some initial reactant A, we convert it to some intermediate product B, B is converted to maybe another intermediate C, and then maybe C is converted to a final product D. So we have an initial reactant A, a final product D, And we have a series of reactions here, three actually, 1, 2, and 3, that convert A into intermediate B, B then into intermediate product C, and C into final product D. That's a pathway. It's a multi-step chemical reaction. Catabolic pathways take a large, energy-rich, complex initial reactant, A here for example, call it a big sugar molecule, and they break it down into small, simple, low-energy products, all right? Cellular respiration is a good example of this. In the case of cell respiration, we have a glucose molecule, C6H12O6, plus 6 oxygens, and there's this arrow here, this one arrow I'm showing you represents a lot of reactions, 30 plus chemical reactions that ultimately break that sugar molecule, the glucose, down into CO2, water, and they release energy. So E with an up arrow means energy. So this is a catabolic reaction because it's taking a large, complex, energy-rich molecule and breaking it down to small, energy-poor molecules like CO2 and water and releasing the energy that used to be bound up as potential energy in the covalent bonds of the molecule, okay? Now, one way to remember catabolic reactions, when I was an undergraduate, one of my first biology professors told us a story about how he remembered catabolic reactions or what it meant. He had cats, and apparently his cats would occasionally climb the drapes in his living room, and they would tear the drapes off the wall. And he associated that with catabolic reactions because cats tear things down, right? So catabolic reactions tear a big molecule down into small, simple molecules. That's one way you can think of that. And that's the way I've remembered it ever since, honestly. So cell respiration is a catabolic pathway, okay? All right, and we're going to see exactly how cell respiration works in Chapter 9. Okay, now, before we get on to the other kinds of pathways that we'll talk about, the other major category, let's again go back and define metabolism. Okay, so again, metabolism, think of it as the totality or the sum total of an organism's chemical reactions, right? All those trillions and trillions of chemical reactions going on in our bodies every second. Metabolism is one of those emergent properties of life. And so this idea or concept, rather, metabolism emerges from the orderly interactions between molecules. Remember, emergent properties are properties, new properties that emerge as we take simple things and build them into ever more complex associations, right? So metabolism is an emergent property of all of these chemical reactions between various kinds of molecules. All right, and as I said, a metabolic pathway is, or I showed you a catabolic pathway, but you could also consider this more generally just as a metabolic pathway. It is a series of chemical reactions that ultimately convert some sort of initial reactant into some sort of final product, okay? And one thing I did not mention earlier is that each of these smaller chemical reactions, A to B, B to C, and C to D, is catalyzed by its own specific enzyme, okay? Remember, enzymes are catalytic proteins that facilitate or help chemical reactions move forward more quickly. All right, so let's take a look. So here we have just an example of a metabolic reaction. So we have reaction 1, which converts our starting reactant A into our intermediate B. Enzyme 1 runs that reaction. Intermediate B is converted by reaction 2 and enzyme 2 into intermediate C. Intermediate C is converted by reaction 3 and enzyme 3 into our final product D. So that's a relatively simple metabolic pathway. Most pathways are more complex and have a lot more steps than that. But an important point about this is that these enzymes make these pathways possible. These pathways probably would not occur without the enzymes present, and they certainly wouldn't occur as fast as we need them to occur for life to exist without the enzymes present. Okay, so whoops, go back for a second. Another kind of pathway besides catabolic, and I'll just write this right here, is anabolic. Okay, anabolic pathways. Anabolic pathways are the reverse of catabolic. So if we think of a catabolic pathway as one that tears a large molecule down into simpler components and releases energy, think of an anabolic pathway as one that builds. You take simple components and build them into more complex structure. So to associate that, think about anabolic steroids. Why do some athletes choose to take anabolic steroids? Because they artificially build muscle, right? Enhancing performance and that sort of thing. So think of anabolic as building. Photosynthesis is an anabolic process. So in photosynthesis, we have 6 molecules of CO2 plus 6 molecules of water in the presence of light energy, or with an input of light energy, and the plant builds a glucose, C6H12O6, and produces 6 molecules of oxygen. All right, so here we have simple building components, CO2 and water, low energy, simple reactants. With an input of light energy, they're reconstructed into something more complex, glucose molecule, and oxygen is produced as a byproduct. So this is building. We're building glucose out of simple building materials, CO2 and water. That's what anabolic means. And this is going to require an input of energy, whereas a catabolic process is going to release energy. Okay. Another good example of this, linking amino acids together to build proteins. Linking nucleotides together to build nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. Those are great examples of anabolic pathways. Excuse me. Okay, so we want to understand how energy flows through living systems, and we have to do that by understanding both catabolic and anabolic processes. And the study of how energy flows through living systems is called bioenergetics. Okay, bioenergetics, the study of how energy flows through living organisms. And certainly this is all wrapped up in metabolism. All right, to do this, we have to first of all understand what energy is. Okay, now energy is kind of a difficult concept to put your thumb on. It's very difficult to describe or define energy. So what we tend to do is define energy in terms of the various forms that it comes in. Okay, let's apply first of all the general definition that you almost always get for energy. You probably heard this. Energy is the capacity to cause change. Energy is the capacity to do work, that sort of thing, right? Does that really tell you what energy is? No, but that's the best definition we really have for energy. Okay. Now, as I said, energy does exist in various forms, and some of which can be used to perform work. All right. So first of all, we have, and I'll just write these up here because I forgot to put a blank slide after this one. We have kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is energy of motion. Okay, energy associated with motion. So any object that is moving through space is moving because it has kinetic energy, all right? Now, think about molecular motion. We talked about back in chapter, 7, last chapter, when we were talking about diffusion, the reason why molecules diffuse is because they're vibrating around due to molecular motion, they collide and move away from each other. That's why things diffuse from high concentration to low. So, I also said that the warmer the temperature, the faster things diffuse, right? Okay. Think of kinetic energy associated with random movement of atoms or molecules as heat. So heat is a form of kinetic energy. When you take the temperature of a glass of water, what you're doing indirectly is measuring the amount of molecular motion in those molecules of water. So a cold glass of water, say one at, let's say room temperature 20, 25 degrees Celsius, will have a certain amount of molecular motion in the molecules of water. You put a thermometer in there, you get a temperature of 25 degrees C, let's say, and that's telling you indirectly how much molecular motion is going on, how much the molecules are vibrating, how much heat they have. Take the temperature of water near boiling, maybe 98 Celsius, and you get a higher number, obviously 98 degrees Celsius. That's giving you an indirect measure of how much those molecules are moving, how much heat they have. The more heat, the more molecular motion. So the molecules of water in the hot, near boiling cup of water are moving much faster rather than the water molecules in the cold cup of water or room temperature cup. Okay, so heat is the thermal energy. It's energy associated or kinetic energy associated with random movement of atoms or molecules. Okay. We also have potential energy. Potential energy is energy that matter possesses because of its location or its structure. Okay. So location. Think of placing a pen on top of a desk and precariously balancing it on the edge. That pen, being 2.5, 3 feet above the floor, has more potential energy than it would if it were on the floor. If you tip it and it falls to the floor, it releases that potential energy it had at higher elevation. How do you know it releases the energy? Because when it hits the ground, you hear a sound, a shock wave that's produced, right? That's energy being released. Okay. It also loses heat or energy through heat with friction with the atmosphere as it falls, although that's more difficult to see. So that's an example of potential energy that matter has because of its location. High elevation objects have more energy than low elevation objects. A high elevation object falls to the ground, it loses gravitational potential energy and comes to rest and has less potential energy on the ground than it had at high elevation. Now, what about potential energy in the structure of something? Well, think about the potential energy that's stored in the bonds between the carbon and hydrogen and oxygen atoms of a sugar molecule. That is potential energy stored in the structure of the molecule. You break that molecule down, you release the energy. This is what powers your car down the road as you're driving down the road. Your car, the combustion chamber, the engine is breaking down the fat molecules of gasoline, gasoline's fat, and turning it into CO2 and water vapor and various other low energy products. As you break that molecule of gasoline down, you're releasing the potential energy stored in the hydrocarbon portion of those molecules and using that to move you down the road. But most of it actually goes off as heat. That's why the engine heats up and so on. Okay, but that's it. Potential energy stored in the structure of something. We also call that chemical energy. So the chemical energy in our food or in gasoline molecules is the potential energy stored in their structure, and that's the energy that our cells are breaking down, are trying to get at when they break down our food molecules, or that your car's engine is trying to get at when it breaks down the gasoline molecules. Okay. Now, we talked about the various forms of energy that are important for understanding metabolism, right? So kinetic, potential, and so on. The nice thing about energy is that it can be converted from one form to another. And that's what cells do. They convert energy from one form to another. So let's take a look at this figure from your textbook. This is a really good example of energy conversion. So you have these people probably out in Lake Tahoe or something like that, and they're swimming and diving off this diving platform. Okay, so let's assume that these people have just eaten lunch, right? Or breakfast, whatever. They've had a meal. They've taken in potential energy, chemical potential energy in the form of their food, and their metabolism is breaking these food molecules down and supplying it as energy to their muscles as they're swimming, as they're climbing the ladder, that kind of thing. So remember, low elevation objects have low potential energy in terms of energy stored in the location of something. High elevation objects have high potential energy. So how do you get from low potential energy at low elevation to high potential energy at high elevation up on the diving platform? Our muscles have to convert the potential energy stored as chemical energy in the molecules of food that we've consumed. They have to break those molecules of food down, convert that potential energy to kinetic energy, energy of motion, which then moves us from low potential in terms of location to high potential. You can't get from low potential to high potential, from low elevation to high, without spending energy. Where does the energy come from? You have to convert potential energy from food into kinetic energy to move you from point A to point B. All right. Now, in the process of doing that, the high potential energy, or some of it, of the food molecules is converted to heat. Think about it. You become very active, you produce a lot of heat, you get warm, you sweat, that kind of thing. So this woman here, as she climbs, is converting a good bit of the potential energy of her food molecules into heat. But some of it is being converted to kinetic energy of motion as she moves up to the diving platform. So now she's up here at higher elevation, higher potential energy, dives off, and what do you see and hear when a person lands in the water? You see a splash, you hear the splash. That's that higher potential energy dissipating away as the person impacts the water. They're also producing heat through friction, which is part of that potential energy as well. So the energy stored in her muscles as she's climbing here eventually is converted to high potential energy. That same energy is then given back off to the environment as heat and as sort of a shock wave when the person hits the water, a splash, and now they're back to low potential. They can get back up to high potential again, but they have to extract more energy from their food molecules. So this is a good example of converting potential to kinetic and kinetic back to potential again, okay? All right, so this gets us then to talking about thermodynamics. Okay, thermodynamics. So this is an area of physics, but we're not going to go into it in a lot of detail. We're going to talk about the concepts that are important here for understanding how cells process energy. Thermodynamics is the study of energy transformations. So think about an isolated system. Think about a system that contains a certain amount of energy and it's thoroughly 100% insulated so that it cannot lose energy or gain energy, right? We can kind of approximate that with a really good thermos, but even that thermos will lose heat over time, okay? So in an isolated system, there's no energy exchange with the outside environment. If you could build an isolated system, which we can't, but if you could, and there was a certain amount of heat energy inside of it, temperature was, say, 100 degrees Celsius inside that isolated system, if it were 100% efficient, 100% isolated, it would not lose any heat, and therefore its temperature would remain 100 degrees Celsius forever. That kind of system doesn't exist because energy always leaves a system, okay? So that means that systems are actually open systems with regard to energy, but also materials. Energy comes in, energy goes out. Materials come in, materials go out. So in an open system, energy and matter can be transferred between the system and the surroundings. Organisms are open systems, okay? They are open systems. Think about it. You're giving off body heat, right? You move from point A to point B during your day. You'll lose energy that way. Well, you have to replace that energy. How do you do that? You eat. You eat lunch or breakfast or dinner or whatever. So the reason we have to not constantly, but eat 3 square meals a day, let's say, is because as we go throughout our day, energy is seeping out of our bodies as heat, various other forms as well, okay? So we have to replace that. That's because we're open systems. What happens if you stop eating? 3 or 4 weeks, the body shuts down and dies. That's starvation. That's because there's not enough energy to power the systems of the body anymore because you've not replaced what it is constantly losing because it's an open system. Okay, so we have a couple of laws of thermodynamics, all right? So we have the first law of thermodynamics, and this one is pretty simple, and you've probably heard of it before. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy can be transferred and transformed, but it cannot be created or destroyed. That means, in the biggest picture concept possible, that, for example, in the universe, all the energy that is in the universe is all that has ever been in the universe and all that will ever be in the universe. All right? So that means that the energy that's in the universe, the finite amount that's there, is constantly cycling between one object and the next and being converted from one form to another. Okay? So the first law then is called the principle of conservation of energy. And again, it says that energy can be transferred and transformed. So we can transfer it from one object to another. We can transform it from one type to another, potential to kinetic, let's say. But we cannot create it and we cannot destroy it. Okay? That's the first law of thermodynamics, called the principle of conservation of energy. All right. We also have the second law of thermodynamics. Now, the second law is a little bit more complicated, a little bit harder to understand, but I demonstrated it in that previous slide with the swimmers in the water. So, according to the second law of thermodynamics, during every energy transfer or transformation, some energy is unusable and is typically lost as heat. Okay? So this is basically saying that energy transformations, energy transfers or transformations are not 100% efficient. When you convert potential energy to kinetic, not all of that potential energy is converted to kinetic. Some of it's lost as heat, and it goes off in the environment and becomes unusable. Okay, so that's essentially what the second law of thermodynamics says. A more sort of scientific way to put it is that every energy transfer or transformation increases the entropy of the universe. Okay, what is entropy? Entropy is a measure of disorder. It's a measure of disorder, all right? So this is a very important concept in thermodynamics and bioenergetics and understanding metabolism. So think of a living cell. A living cell is highly ordered. It's highly structured, okay? Why is it like that? Because it has a lot of potential energy. So think of it this way. The more potential energy a system or a structure or whatever has, the more ordered it will be. Think about it. If your room's a mess, does it take energy to straighten it up and make it more orderly? Yes, you have to apply a lot of energy, do a lot of work to clean up the room and convert it from a mess to an orderly, structured environment. Okay, so entropy then is a measure of disorder. If I tell you that a system has high entropy, that means it has high disorder. It's a mess. A messy bedroom is a high entropy system, high disorder. You go in and clean up that room, you're injecting energy into the system by cleaning it up, literally, and you decrease its entropy. You make it more ordered. It becomes a low entropy system, a highly ordered system. So high entropy equals disorder, low entropy equals ordered. Entropy is a measure of disorder. The more entropy, the more disorder, the less entropy, the lower the entropy, the more highly ordered the system is. Okay? All right. So let's look at an example here of second law, first law and second law. So here we have this bear, right? And this bear has caught himself a salmon, probably up in Alaska somewhere. Okay. What does first law say? First law says that energy cannot be created or destroyed. We can only transform it and transfer it. Okay, so the bear cannot just, out of nothing, make energy for itself. If it's going to get energy to power itself, it has to get it from something else. In this case, it's gotten it from the potential energy of the fish, right? The fish got the potential energy from whatever it's been eating for however long it's been alive, okay? So the bear is consuming the flesh of the fish, and that is giving it the energy that it needs. It's being a transfer of energy from the fish tissue into the bear, okay? We can't just make energy out of nothing. We have to get it from somewhere. That's first law. Okay, second law. Every energy transfer or transformation increases the entropy or disorder of the universe. So the bear is taking in complex molecules from the fish tissue, so proteins, sugars, fats, nucleic acids. Those are energy-rich, complex molecules, sources of energy, high potential energy. The bear is breaking them down to convert the energy, the potential energy, to kinetic energy as it runs after its next meal, right? So it's using the potential energy to power itself, converting potential to kinetic as it goes after its next meal. When it does that, when it breaks down those energy-rich, low entropy food molecules from the fish, it converts them to energy-poor, simple, high entropy molecules like CO2 and water. So think of it as almost, taking a protein molecule or a fat molecule, it's highly ordered, low entropy, and ripping it apart and just throwing the remains into the environment. It's increasing the entropy of the environment, littering up the environment with the remains of those low entropy, high energy food molecules, okay? So this is what second law says, right? Every energy transformation, energy transfer right here into the bear, and transformation, potential to kinetic, increases the entropy or disorder of the environment. So you can think of the environment here as the environment around the bear, littering up the environment with CO2 and water, which are low energy, high entropy remains of these high energy, low entropy food molecules that used to be the fish. All right, that's second law. Okay. So let's look at an example of this. I have an animation here to kind of show these concepts.
Energy is the capacity to cause change. Kinetic energy is the energy associated with motion. Energy that is not kinetic is called potential energy, and is energy that matter possesses because of its location or structure. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, but converted from one form to another. This property is called the conservation of energy.
The bow and arrow start out with low potential energy. As the archer's arm pulls back the string, kinetic energy from the arm's motion is converted to potential energy in the tense bowstring and arrow. When the bowstring is released, the stored potential energy is converted into the kinetic energy of the moving arrow. When the arrow hits the target, its motion ceases. If energy is neither created nor destroyed, where did the energy of the flying arrow go? Let's rewind and look at kinetic energy in more detail. When energy is converted from potential energy to kinetic energy, some of the energy can be used to do work, but some energy ends up as heat, a type of kinetic energy. Heat is the random motion of atoms and molecules. As the arrow flies through the air, heat is generated by friction between the arrow and air molecules. When the arrow strikes the target, all the energy becomes heat energy. The heat energy is rapidly transferred into the air and spreads out. Heat energy is a very disordered kind of energy. It has the highest amount of entropy, or disorder, of any kind of energy. Where do our muscles get energy to perform work, such as pulling back a bowstring? Our bodies use the chemical energy from food to perform work. Chemical energy is a form of potential energy. When your body breaks down food molecules, the stored potential energy from food can be converted to kinetic energy. The stored chemical energy in food is released in your muscle cells during the process of cellular respiration. Using oxygen, cellular respiration converts chemical energy from food to another form of chemical energy called ATP. Water, H2O, and carbon dioxide, CO2, are byproducts of cellular respiration. The potential energy of ATP can be converted to kinetic energy. Some of the kinetic energy is used to do useful work, such as pulling back a bowstring, but the heat energy that is generated cannot be used to do work.
Okay, so now let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about something, sort of a side issue related to second law of thermodynamics, entropy, and all that. When we look at processes in biology or biochemistry, like, photosynthesis, so a plant taking CO2 and water and building that into sugar, or cell respiration, your muscle cells taking sugar molecules and breaking them down to CO2 and water, or any other kind of metabolic reaction, we want to understand if that reaction happens with or without an input of energy. Okay, this is very important. So we can define a process that occurs without an input of energy as spontaneous. Okay, spontaneous process. A spontaneous process is one that occurs on its own without an input of energy. They can happen quickly or slowly, it just depends. But here's the thing, for a process to occur without an energy input, okay, like a big molecule breaking down into a small molecule, or a house that's not being maintained, slowly breaking down over time, for a process to occur without an energy input, it must increase the entropy of the universe, right? So think about a house. Let's say you move into a house, it's brand new, just been built, everything's immaculate, it's perfect, everything's right where it should be, right? Everything's great. You live in that house for 50 years, and let's say over that time you don't lift a finger to maintain it. Is that house going to look the way it did on day one at the end of 50 years? No. You know it's going to decay and break down on its own. Nails are going to pop, shingles are going to degrade, fall off the roof, paint will chip and peel, the wood will rot. You know this is going to happen, right? Why is that? It's because the house is a high energy low entropy system. It will break down spontaneously because, as I said, high energy systems will lose energy to the environment around them. You're doing it right now. You're producing body heat. You're a high energy system, your tissues are, and it's producing heat, and that heat is seeping away the environment. How do you prevent that from happening, or how do you, I should say, compensate for that? You maintain it by eating more food. How do you keep your house immaculate? You maintain it. You put energy into it through work, right? You paint it, you put on a new roof, whatever. So spontaneous processes then are those that occur on their own because the natural tendency is for high energy systems to lose energy, all right? So we have a couple very important, actually about 4 very important concepts that are all kind of related here. So let's say that we're talking about the energy content of a system, okay? And let's say that on the left we have low energy, and on the right we have high energy, all right? Now, there are 3 concepts that we can understand related to energy, how much energy there is in a system. There is, first of all, stability, okay? So how stable a system is, how resistant a system is to change, okay? We can talk about complexity, how complex a system is, and we can talk about, as we've already said, entropy, how much entropy a system has. So on the left, let's look at the low energy system. A low energy system has high stability because it doesn't have a lot of energy to lose to the environment, so it kind of stays the way that it is. But a low energy system is going to have low complexity, and because it's low energy and low complexity, it's going to be chaotic. It's going to have high disorder or high entropy, all right? So think of the house, right? You've lived in it for 50 years, you've not lifted a finger to maintain it. The house started off as high energy, but it lost energy over time. Now 50 years later, it's very low energy. So it's very stable, right? A house that's fallen in on itself will sit there as a pile of rubble and will be an eyesore for decades, okay? Because it doesn't have a lot of energy left to lose, so it just kind of stays the way that it is. What about its complexity? Its complexity has gone down as it's broken down. It's become very disordered, very chaotic. Its complexity goes down. It's a pile of rubble now, right? And its entropy, its measure of disorder, has gone up because now it's just a mess. Would you want to live in it? No. All right, now let's look at the house the day you move in. It's just been built. It's high energy. It's very complex, okay? So its complexity is high. What about stability? That house begins to break down the minute you move into it because it's seeping energy away to the environment, just like your body is, right? So its stability is very low. And what about its entropy, its measure of disorder, initially when you first move into it, when it's brand new? Its entropy is very low, all right? So that high energy system that is the house, or a cell, or a large protein molecule will eventually seep away to the environment through second law of thermodynamics, like we said. Its stability will go down, all right? It will go to low stability, I should say. It'll start off with being very unstable, okay? So initially it's very unstable, has low stability, and its complexity is very high initially. Its entropy is very low. But as energy sort of, seeps away from that system, its stability will go from low to high, its complexity will go from high to low, and its entropy will go from low to high. This is what always happens with high energy systems. So think of a high energy system like a cell or a protein or a DNA molecule as, again, high energy, so it's complex, it's unstable, and it has low entropy. Nature will take that system, which starts off here, and convert it into this system on the left. So how do we fight against that? We have to inject energy back in to convert this system back into that system, okay? That's why we have maintenance crews on campus to maintain our buildings, because they're constantly breaking down. That's why roads break down and we have crews come in and resurface them every once in a while, okay? If you think about it, this explains a lot of what you see going on around you, all right? Okay, I think that's a good place to stop for this chapter. We'll pick up next with on the second video for this chapter with biological order and disorder.